Our second finalist for this prize is Ethan Kalishman, who is also a senior. His speech is focused on urban planning.
Despite the fact that Budweiser and I were created in the same city, it can seem hard for people to have positive perceptions about St. Louis, Missouri. It feels especially true at a place like Hamilton College, where some students don't even realize that flyover country still is part of the country. When people do think about St. Louis, they don't think like I do about how we have this incredibly rich history in hosting the World's Fair, Olympic trials, and by the way, Earth's tallest monument, the Gateway Arch. Most people don't even realize you can get to the top through an elevator that honestly reminds me of a porta potty. Even our team's spirit is high. The Cardinals baseball team was second in the MLB in 2022, drawing 3.3 million fans. That attendance is on par with LA, Chicago, and New York. Now, more in my taste, St. Louis also happens to host the second largest Mardi Gras celebration outside of New Orleans, of course, but that includes the nation's longest running Wiener Dog Derby. Now, my heart literally beats faster when I think about all that my city has to offer, but maybe that's just me being a crazy Wiener Dog Derby fan. I feel the same way when I talk about Hamilton College, though, but maybe that's also just me being a sappy second semester senior. Credibility aside, by the end of this speech, I want you to fall in love with St. Louis in the same way that I have too. However, the consensus at Hamilton seems to be far different from that reality. I've actually had students come up to me and ask what my favorite farm chore at the ranch is. And they somehow seem stunned every time when I reveal to them that the closest I've ever gotten to a cow in St. Louis was at the dairy aisle. I actually see far more pastoral life up here in central New York. And when it's not farming, I'm often left faltering to answer for my city's other most notable accomplishment, murder. But it's true. St. Louis has the highest homicide rate in the nation at 9 per 1,000 people. To put it into perspective, that's like if at Hamilton every single year, 18 students got murdered. While it is clear that my city is very polarized, I firmly believe that these challenges don't define it, or at least they shouldn't. I am just as proud to be from Missouri as I'm also aware of our faults. And I want to talk about bridging both ends of that spectrum by talking about the Delmar divide. Delmar Boulevard is a major road in St. Louis that separates the city from the north and the south. To the north, the median home value is $73,000. 10% of the population has a college education, and 98% of the population is Black. Now, by contrast, to the south of Delmar, the median home value is $335,000. 70% of the population is white, has a college education, and 73% of the population is white. I'm going to say that one more time. $73,000 versus $335,000. That is 210% more money for a home on the other side of the same street. And yet, whichever side of the street that someone lives on means everything. Because the amount of public funding comes from property taxes and those are dependent on home values, there is a huge disparity between the amount of money that northern communities have and southern communities have in relation to Delmar Boulevard. For example, in northern communities of Delmar, schools receive 30% less funding per student in comparison to those in the South, largely on trend with the home prices being so far different. There are also health implications. Northern communities on the side of Delmar have more fast food restaurants. They have more liquor stores and convenience stores in comparison to healthy food grocers in the South. There's also more industrialized spaces, violent crime, and pollution in the north because they have more factories and fewer public services like in the South, which have more green spaces and public services. As a result to all of this, people die sooner in the north. In fact, someone born in the white wealthy suburb of Clayton below Delmar Boulevard actually has 18 years more of a life expectancy than someone born in the Jeff Vanderloo neighborhoods north of Delmar. It almost doesn't sound believable, but the Delmar divide is very real. and it has very real impacts on people's daily lives. This all came to a head in 2020, when, like so many other communities in our country, St. Louis streets were flooded with people fighting for racial justice. One of those streets was Delmar Boulevard. In one instance, two white citizens emerged from their home and pointed their own guns at demonstrators for entering their neighborhood. The key here is that their fingers were literally on the trigger of their guns. While already horrific, this not in my backyard mentality runs so much deeper. That's because the Delmar Divide was not created overnight, but instead because of decades of housing policy. In the early 20th century, the white-controlled real estate industry employed a system of racial policies to drive the city's growing Black population to the north and take the white population and push them to the south. And they did so by only selectively showing them homes on either side of Delmar Boulevard. Even worse, the government actually financed this. Between 1947 and 1952, of the 70,000 housing units created, only 35 individual units went to Black Americans. In the 1960s, of the 400,000 St. Louis area mortgages backed by the government, 3.3% went to Black American borrowers. This trend persisted even today, in 2024, as I give this speech. It almost doesn't sound believable. It also seems like we've abandoned hope. But the operative word here is seems. It only seems that way. Because one local project, Delmar Divine, not Divide, Divine, is attempting to redefine the neighborhood. Delmar Divine is a $100 million rehabilitation of an urban defunct hospital at the north end of Delmar. The 2021 renovation included 150 affordable housing units, included a nonprofit collaborative aimed at fighting injustices, includes offices as well as cafe and community space. The funding for this project comes from a public-private partnership that ironically includes government insurance on the loan. But notably, this facility has already made a marked difference in our communities. While this is one facility, it is not an end-all be-all solution to the Delmar Divide, but it does show that our cities are improvable and we have agency to redesign our mistakes of the past. Yes, it is true that St. Louis, like me, is odd and maybe slightly unhinged. Yeah, we eat deep fried ravioli, we slice our bagels vertically. We created Metro Boomin. We may not see those things as issues, but when it comes to our problematic history of urban planning, there are attempts to rectify our mistakes, and that matters. There is no endpoint to urban design, and Delmar Divine presses forward to a new beginning for St. Louis. As we move forward throughout our lives, we will never find that 100% perfect, ideal utopia, but we will find some things that we just strangely attach ourselves to. Maybe it's Hamilton, maybe it's someone else, or maybe, like in my case, it's the Midwest. But however we find those things, we ought to do our best to make them the best they can be. Although what I will say is, you can't have our wiener dogs. Thank you. Yes. Thank you for your question. Yeah, I think that the light side, dark side division is pretty stark. I think not necessarily in the ways that I would say that when we look at the dark side, we look at the light side, we can see that freshman year, you don't really have control over where you live. But ultimately, once you do gain control sophomore year, junior year, you can decide where to live. Of course, that power is a lot more free than something like urban planning, but it does dictate your friendships. It dictates the dining hall you use. It dictates your entire life, even your classes to some extent. We can see that STEM students will tend to live on the light side and arts and humanities students will live on the dark side. And I think that at Hamilton, we can realize that sometimes we get a little bit insulated. And one of the things that we can do is try to access new places on this campus and access new friendships, new relationships. And we have that opportunity to just cross College Hill Road. So we should take advantage of it. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, the school districts are zoned differently along Delmar. So the communities in the north actually have their own districts in comparison to the south. I think that revising the school system a lot of times depends on funding. And I think that we can do a lot better by increasing salaries for teachers, incentivizing people to go into this industry. And I think that we also need to have a dedicated approach in the north because they are so far behind in the funding levels primarily. And from there, we can work on college education, preparedness, and other resources that are completely underfunded by just by the sake of housing. Great, thank you.